Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. India-China relations are a cornerstone in both countries' foreign policies, given their geographical proximity, strong economic relations, and their relevance in global geopolitics. These relations were, in bureaucratic terms, frozen since the Galwan Valley clash. The mass mobilization of defense troops by China and India across the line of control led to a nosedive in the relationship. Since then, the two countries have been engaging in dialogue, and recently there has been a breakthrough, with both parties agreeing to disengage in Depsang and Demchok areas, two contentious areas across the LOC. Positive statements by the Indian and Chinese government has been seen as a beacon of hope, especially when there was a logjam in the relations for quite some time. To further understand this, joining me today is Dr. Sidharth Raimedhi, Fellow at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research, New Delhi. Welcome, Dr. Raimedhi.
Hi, Devyani. It's good to be here.
Great. So, my first question to you is India and China recently reached an agreement on disengagement in Depsang and Demchok, with troops returning to pre-2020 positions. Could you clarify the implications of this disengagement, particularly the technical and geopolitical significance of the steps, disengagement, de-escalation, and de-induction?
Right. So, just to try to capture the essence of what had just occurred on the 21st of October, which was the announcement by India's Foreign Secretary that an agreement has been achieved. So, ever since the standoff began in 2020, there have been 7 in all friction areas. And till now, only in 5 of them, disengagement has been achieved. And the remaining ones were Depsang and Demchok, as you had just mentioned. And hence, the idea was since 2020 that the standoff will be resolved through a sequential process of 3 steps. The first is disengagement, the second is de escalation, the third is de induction. What disengagement basically means is that because the troops were forward deployed, at, near, or across the LAC, the objective is to achieve a breathing space to avoid an eyeball to eyeball confrontation, which could actually lead to another Galwan kind of skirmish. And hence, to achieve that, there was a need to operationalize what is known as buffer zones, but also now increasingly their term, there's demilitarized zones. India and China had achieved this in areas such as Galwan, Pangong Tso, Hot Springs, Gogra. But because the negotiations were stuck on the core issues of Depsang and Demchok, neither side could basically claim that disengagement has been achieved. And without the achievement of disengagement, the two sides could not then move on to the subsequent steps of de-escalation and de-induction. Now, what de-escalation and de-induction means is de-escalation is the return of forward deployed soldiers to their traditional garrisons and bases. And de-induction adds on to that through the removal of equipment which had been deployed in forward areas back to the depth areas. So this is the whole idea behind the resolution of the standoff. So technically, so the LAC is a temporary interim boundary between India and China, right? And hence it's mostly marked by patrolling points. So what had happened in 2020 was that China blocked several of these patrolling points. For instance, in Depsang, China did it at the Y junction area, which is also known as bottleneck, denying India access to 5 key patrolling points in the Depsang plains. So, according to this agreement, the two sides have agreed to restore the patrolling rights, but it's an evolving story. And as of now, it seems that only one of those patrolling points have been accessed and in a verified manner, which is patrol point 10. And the modalities of the remaining 4 patrolling points in Depsang are being still worked out. So this is the technical part of it. And the basic essence of it is that there is an agreement to resolve these two. Now, exactly how the final agreement on the patrols pan out, we'll have to wait and see for that. That's more or less a technical question. Now, the geopolitical question, there are two ways of looking at it. One is the importance of Depsang region itself, and to the viewers, I'd just like to emphasize that over the last few decades, it has been seen as a very strategic. In fact, Depsang is the most strategic area, and according to strategic analyst Manoj Joshi, of the 1,000 square kilometers of new territory that China has possessed or come into ever since 2020, 900 square kilometer is in Depsang. And over the last few years, there has been a growing thought in Indian strategic circles that Depsang can serve as a launch pad towards Aksai Chin, and especially in an emergency operation which is aimed at attacking the G219 highway. So there is some analysis that China may have sensed India's strengthening position in this region as a threat and had decided in 2020 to offset the same threat. So that is the geopolitical aspect when it comes to just the geography of the region itself. But other than that, the larger geopolitics of this agreement is slightly different and it goes beyond the LAC. To me, the main story is not that after several negotiations, an agreement has been achieved and a deadlock has been removed, but the larger story has been evolving, I think, over the last 2 years, which is that there has been a growing shift in India's approach and policy towards China. There has been a growing interest in repairing and restoring normalization of ties with China, and there are various reasons for it. There is a military reason. India wants to avoid high cost, high risk arms race across the LAC, and the geography and terrain is such that such an arms race is more disadvantageous to India and its national economic goals than perhaps to China. Economically, we've seen a lot of commentary and reports of late. Example, the economic survey report of the government of India, which basically explored the idea that that despite the standoff, India can stand to benefit from investments from China and greater economic cooperation, and also geopolitical reasons. There are several geopolitical reasons, but one I'd like to highlight is that the Russia's ever closer relationship with China has come at the cost of India's what is known as geopolitical sweet spot. So it has fewer buffers between India and China due to Russia's choice of getting closer to China. And there have been a few strains in India's relations with the US over the last 1 year. And this has been highlighted in various commentaries as well. And hence, there was a need from geopolitical, economic, and military perspective to avoid getting sucked into a trap, to an increasing trap in India's relations with China. And hence, that created the political incentive to reach an agreement with China. And as you could see from news reports, it was there is a parallel understanding about restoring patrolling rights for the PLA in other areas. For instance, in Arunachal Pradesh, in a contentious and strategic area called Yangtze, as well as Asafila. So this agreement is key only because it also facilitates the normalization of ties between India and China, and that, of course, has huge and significant geopolitical implications. So the resolution of Demchok and Depsang technically amounts to the first step in the overall process of terminating the 4-year-long standoff. The follow-up steps are, of course, de-escalation and de-induction. However, there are two things that need to be kept in mind. First is that the second and third steps are, which is de-escalation and de-induction, are clearly within the realm of national sovereignty and autonomy, because they involve the movement and deployment of troops within a country's national borders, right? So to that degree, these are choices within the prerogative of a nation state, right? So that is a bit hard to agree to at times, right? Disengagement, on the other hand, it involves slightly trickier issues pertaining to the establishment of the rules on the ground in areas which are importantly gray and contested, where norms of sovereignty may take a backseat and the use of force could dominate. And hence, disengagement is the first step, but it also is, in a way, the most important, and it sets the tone for the other two steps and if whether they would occur or not in the first place. And it's also worth pointing out that the disengagement in the five other areas has been established through buffer zones. And until now, there is no clarity whether about the 21st October agreement, whether that also requires a dismantling of these buffer zones. So we'll have to wait and watch if the final, if the agreement, if it seems that the agreement does not include the buffer zones, that in a way that disadvantages India's position definitely, right?
Thank you, Dr. Remedy. I think that is quite insightful. You have really laid out the map in some sense of how it started and what are India's possible motives um, to sort of facilitate disengagement. So, until recently, actually, we saw China hesitating to discuss the Depsang and Demchok areas, and the discussion of disengagement was far off the table. So, what, according to you, are factors that might have influenced China's shift towards cooperation in these disputed regions? You have laid out factors that sort of enabled or motivated India's incentive to cooperate or repair and restore its relationship with China. But what are certain factors that could have been um, that could have changed in the last few years, actually, that could have incentivized China to also enable disengagement?
Right. So that's absolutely right. That's a bigger mystery. So in a sense, even in India, analysts are more clear about why India is keen to resolve the standoff. After all, India is the aggrieved party over here, and India is the country which is asking for a restoration of status quo ante April 2020, right? And there have been reports that since September 2022, China has adopted a very intransigent approach, even during core commander level talks on the issue of Depsang and Demchok, especially Depsang. And they've been even at times unwilling to discuss Depsang. And that had led to the sense and perception amongst many that maybe Depsang is so intractable that it may never be resolved. I'm not saying it's still completely resolved, but there seems to be a shift in China's position to some degree. And that indeed requires an explanation. Now, just to take the viewer through some arguments that possibly explain China's motive. Some allude to China's economy not doing that great of late, and it's the need of Chinese businesses to diversify across the globe and set up production units and funnel its investments across various emerging markets. But to me, that is not entirely compelling because we've heard this many times before, and Chinese economy has been in a way struggling since 2011. And at any point of time, China would have had good reason, economic reason to do this. So the timing from the economic point of view is not very clear. The second one is China's increasing challenges, let's say in across the Taiwan Straits, in coercing the Philippines and Vietnam in the Indo-Pacific. Uh, but there is a problem here as well because this assumes that China has to make a trade-off between its military preparedness across both fronts. But the ongoing actions by China in the Pacific are still very gray zone and salami slicing, and there are no signs of China really mobilizing or preparing to undertake an invasion or an all-out war of these countries. So, given that that's the case, it's not very clear as to how its geopolitical imperatives in the Pacific would require it to improve relations with India. So, I'll be a bit wary of that. The third one is about China's anticipation of a future Trump presidency. So this somehow is a slightly more compelling because we saw during the previous Trump administration, China undertook similar initiatives to improve relations with Japan and also with India to a degree because it wanted to improve relations so that it could manage the offensives by Trump in trade and other matters in a more prepared way, right? But here also this agreement took place before the election outcomes, so that requires explanation, right? But my own speculation, and this is still speculation, but my own hunch is that it cannot simply be about the US or even Taiwan. It had to have an India reason. Very often in a lot of our analysis, we kind of dismiss the idea that China's security interests vis-a-vis India are somehow not very important, that it would be because of other reasons that it would reach an agreement with India. But I think that is very dangerous assumption to hold. And it's apparently not true because one has to simply look at Chinese attention and investments near the LAC in terms of its infrastructure, its troop deployment. Famously, it had diverted its combined armed brigades from other theater to the Western Theater Command. It's been constructing railways and highways and underground tunnels for to store ammunition, and it's been building up border villages all across the LAC. So one can simply infer from this that India matters to China and security vis-a-vis India also matters to China. So if that is the case, my own analysis would be that China has found the timing to be somehow right, and China has noticed and noted the evolution of Indian strategic thought towards China, especially at the government level over the last year or two. I think China, for instance, in India, a lot of analysts say that China wanted to teach India a lesson in 2020, right? Because of India's own efforts to strengthen deterrence vis-a-vis China, militarily, economically, geopolitically. So it is possible that China has come to the conclusion that India is now prepared to deal with China in a more realist, in a more pragmatic manner, that India no longer sees the US as a significant asset in its relations vis-a-vis China. And hence, China possibly now has an opportunity to retain some aspects of the new status quo since 2020 while also having a leverage over determining the India-China's future relations and its trajectory. So from a Chinese point of view, this is not a bad time to come to an agreement with India and further nudge India towards normalization of ties. And this will also include nudging India towards focusing on broader areas of cooperation like economics and trade and investments and to not pay attention to the LSE that much going forward.
Absolutely. I think you very rightly pointed to both China and India's intentions. And it is quite interesting because the world that we inherited in 2020 versus the world that we live now in is quite different, with extensive amounts of geopolitical skirmishes across the world, and two wars going on at the time. I think both countries might have revisited their policies. But looking back at, again, China, they've had a very aggressive approach, almost bullish when it comes to their border policies. And they're often politically motivated by their own revisionist ambitions. In light of that, to what extent do you think India should approach this disengagement process with a certain amount of caution? Are you skeptical of the probability of normalization of ties between the two countries? And
Right.
and if you think so, then would you um be able to share a approximate timeline, or maybe sort of show a roadmap as to how you think this would pan out?
Right. So regarding China's objectives and ambitions, I'm not absolutely sure as to if calling it revisionist is entirely useful, but it's definitely one of the hypotheses, and it's a strong one. But this is a key question in the sense that you've raised, that what does China want eventually? And hence India's future posture and choices will have to take that into account. There was a report recently when the Indian Express journalists and Indian media delegation visited China. There was a Chinese official who urged them to think more about the final boundary, right? So not just the LAC. And one of the things he had said is that China has only one proposal, which is the Zhou Enlai's proposed claim line of 1959 to 1960, whereas India has three. He noted the McMahon line in Arunachal Pradesh, the LAC, and then a third line he mentioned is the positions where Indian troops now are, right? So there seems to be a nudge towards resolving the ultimate boundary disagreement, basically, which had evolved in its own way since 1950 to 51. So, so in one scenario, if everything goes right, and the template will be that disengagement will go hand in hand with the imperative to rebuild mutual trust. And for instance, former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale referred to how China and Russia resolved their long-standing border dispute in the 1990s through a sequential process of first building political trust and then establishing almost buffer zones over those territories, right? So that is definitely a template. I think that could be pursued to some degree. But there is a very big but over here, is that it's a enormously difficult border to demarcate and delineate, and differing perceptions are vast and huge. So I don't think it will be wise to be quite optimistic that India and China will be able to go that far and resolve the boundary dispute once and for all. Historically, India wanted to take a sequential approach of resolving the boundary sector by sector, whereas China had famously proposed a package deal whereby India accepts Aksai Chin as being China dominated, and China also accepts Arunachal Pradesh as a done deal for practical reasons. But China has itself been altering the package deal. It's been including Tawang in its core demands ever since 1984 to 85, and the Chinese ambassador to India in 2006 then basically laid claim over the whole of Arunachal Pradesh. And you could see over the last few years how China has undertaken serious efforts to rename various parts of Arunachal Pradesh, from rivers to mountains to villages. So I think there's a significant shift in China's approach to its frontiers all across. And it's based on control rather than achieving a mutually workable resolution. So, and given the growing imbalance of power, I think China will find it very hard to not get tempted by small alterations, by salami slicing, by realigning the LSE based on military expediencies. So, and hence and these are not concerns that only I have. I'm sure the government also has similar concerns, and hence we will not be seeing a letdown in terms of our plans for infrastructure construction and for various military procurements, and our focus on Atmanirbharta. So that part will go on. It's not because at some level the Indian government also understands that even to maintain this level of trust and cooperation, India will have to keep uh, focusing on its military investments and defense preparedness. So yeah, the cliche trust but verify kind of remains.
I thank you so much. I think that's quite interesting. And I want to take you back a few steps and sort of take us through what has not just factors, but how you see India's policy vis-a-vis China to have evolved in the last few years, especially after 2020. Because um, I think what we see as political statements seems to be very limited. So I think in your previous answer sort of spoke about interaction, which is building first political trust and then going on to discussion on the border dispute. I
Right.
think political trust between the two sides would be very difficult to establish given the recent history. But I would be keen to know first what your take on that is, especially because there is not just skepticism on a government to government level, but there's also extensive skepticism on when it comes to people relationship. And usually or in most or many cases, it helps when people to people relations are great because there is extensive investments and cooperation that is working on a people to people level, which can then go up and build trust, if I'm correct.
Right.
uh, if we go back to 2020 and post that, I think there is extensive distrust between both governments on the account of sounding controversial, almost to a degree where, a lot of India considers, for instance, Arunachal Pradesh to be a part of its country, and China sees that as a contentious issues. When you have that deep uh, disagreements, how do you think political trust can be built moving forth? And how do you think India is approaching this whole issue, and how do Indian policymakers and analysts look at this disengagement?
Right. So I think there are two parts to your question. So I'll begin with the first one, which is what has been India's strategy over the last few years, both before and after 2020 Galwan standoff, right? So I think modern day India's, which is, let's say, after the year 2000, 2001, India's strategy was somewhat clear and coherent, and this has transpired across various governments, from I think Vajpayee, Prime Minister Vajpayee, to Manmohan Singh, and then Prime Minister Modi, which is that China's infrastructure construction, especially the Tibet highways in the early 2000s, it was assessed that that was a threat to the balance of power between India and China militarily. And hence, we had broadly three elements. And the objective was quite clear. It was not to humiliate China or to fight China in a war. It was a relatively defensive ultimate objective, which is to establish an equilibrium with China, whereby the two countries can live in peace in the Asian century. But the primary problem to this was that China's occasional encroachments and incursions into Indian territory across the LSE, and China's relative unwillingness to resolve the boundary dispute. This includes even sharing maps and so on. And hence, India's approach was that if I generate enough military investments, and that too in a targeted manner, and hence we move towards a military deterrence by punishment posture, which was never completed, but it was kind of in the works. Then the second part of it is foreign policy, which is that India improved relations with the US and like-minded partners like Australia, Japan. And the calculation was that the threat of gaining closer strategic cooperation with these countries would help discipline Chinese behavior at the LAC, right? And also, of course, there were other benefits to these relationships, economic, foreign policy, but this was one part of the calculation. And so based on your geopolitical advantages and efforts at increasing your military investments, and of course infrastructure construction towards the LAC, India thought that over time, China will acknowledge that India is a growing economic power, a military power, and has strong partners and choices in the international domain, and hence will try to improve relations with India by both perhaps agreeing to a border resolution mechanism, a sincere one, and also limiting or finally eliminating its encroachments and probes across the LAC, right? Be it the Depsang encroachment of 2013 or the Chumar in 2014. So these were the headaches that Indian governments, for political and strategic reasons, were most concerned about. So this was India's strategy, right? And I think what happened is that because of 2020, there is a growing view that to a degree, India's own efforts led to a Chinese overreaction in terms of, for instance, the DSDBO road, the strategic DSDBO road is seen as one of the triggers for Chinese responses because it would then allow India to speedily allocate resources and personnel to various vantage points across Eastern Ladakh, right?
Hmm.
Uh, then India's establishment of a mountain strike corps with the purported aim of counter-offensive operations into Chinese territory for in order to bolster the deterrence. So that also, I think, weighed on the minds of Chinese military planners. And I think there is now a sense in Delhi that instead of reciprocating through cooperation, India's efforts may have pushed China towards doubling down. And hence, China since 2020 has been militarizing the LAC. It has sought to establish domination and dominance across LAC, and also unilaterally tried to realign different parts of the LAC to suit its strategic and military operational interests. So, given that that is the case, I think India is unlikely to go back to that grand strategy before 2020 of trying to establish a better relationship with China based on military economic strength, right? The peace through strength kind of a logic.
Yeah.
I think instead, India will choose to emphasize conciliation, cooperation, and multilateral forums economically through supply chains, FDIs,
Yeah.
exchange of workers, students, media exchanges. And the objective remains, which is to prevent Chinese incursions, encroachments across the LSE. But the means towards that end will now be perhaps more cooperation based, conciliation based, which then requires trust building. So
Yeah.
trust building has to be seen in an instrumental way rather than an effective emotional way.
Mm.
So trust building is an imperative in order to prevent future Galwan, in order to prevent
Yeah.
arms racing and heavy troop deployments across the Himalayas, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether they will be able to build trust again depends on how what do you mean by trust. If it's genuine trust, I don't think that is possible. If it is an expedient, pragmatic trust building exercise, I think that is possible.
I think
Uh,
building trust through interdependence uh, would be a good way to go about it, right? Through cooperation and building interdependence from some sort and increasing people to people investment.
so that's a very classic international relations theory matter, right? And I am a realist when it comes to IR theory. So I myself do not think that interdependence leads to more trust. After all, China, US are as interdependent as ever,
As
but
ever.
trust
Yeah. Yeah.
but trust is a function of other aspects rather than exchanges.
Yeah.
There may be good reasons to enhance economic cooperation with China, and I think there are some strong reasons for that. But I would not expect that to then lead to greater trust, especially if greater interdependence leads to, let's say, more dependence of one party on the other.
Mm.
That in fact then leads to, in a way, less trust because one country has more economic power over the other through threat of disruptions of various exports, supply chains, right?
Mm.
So if trust building has to happen, it will be a very elite driven process, and it will be based on realism 101, balance of power realism, rather than a societal economic avenue.
Mm.
But on that, I'd also like to add one note, which is I had earlier mentioned the China-Russia success, right, at
Mm.
resolving the
Yeah.
conflict in the 90s.
Yes.
So that may seem like an attractive template, but I would have my strong doubts because of various reasons. But
Mm.
the key reason being that that was a very different China, and it had decided to hide its capabilities and bide its time, right? And it
Yeah.
needed to attract foreign investments, form a close partnership with US. So it needed to resolve all of its territorial disputes, which it did with most countries around it, including Central Asia. But now the modern, like the China under Xi Jinping right now, is a very different kind of political entity. Its objective is not resolution of conflict through resolution of territorial disputes, but in a way expansion to suit China's own military and security interests, right? So
Mm.
that template with Russia may seem attractive, but it may also mislead to a degree.
Mm. Thank you, Dr. Remedy, for your time and for really sharing your insights with us on the India-China conflict, what this disengagement means, what are the technical aspects of this disengagement, and the possible roadmap for cooperation in the future.
Thanks for inviting me, Devyani.
You're welcome. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.